to go? Okay. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our public lecture series today. Today we have friends on YouTube, friends on Zoom, and also our students here in the lecture hall at the Malaysian Institute of Art. So thanks everyone for coming today. So today it's our last session of our public lecture series titled Dissecting Design Processes. Our first two sessions were held last week. One was on heritage architecture and adaptive reuse, and the other one was on cultural and educational spaces. So for those of you who wanted to attend but missed it, you can still watch the replay on YouTube. The link will be posted in the chat. And today we have our third session, which will be talking about public buildings and urban politics. So this public lecture series is brought to you by Malaysian Institute of Art and Draf. Malaysian Institute of Art is a non-profit making organization, and we at the Interior Design Department offer the Bachelor of Arts Interior Architecture and Design program with the syllabus adopted from our partner university, Birmingham City University. And we aim to provide students with the skills to transform or give life to new spaces. So for example, this semester in our studio, our students have to work on an existing warehouse, Kongsi KL, and transform it into a performing arts space. So if you want to know more about Malaysian Institute of Art, these are links that you can look to. On the right, we have our website, and on the left, we have the graduation show that is completely curated by our alumni, which have graduated a few months ago, and they have covered a very wide range of topics in their final thesis project. So yeah, do have a look at their work. And we also have Draf, which calls itself 马来西亚第一个中文建筑教育媒体, which means that it is the first independent Chinese architectural media in Malaysia. And among other things, including events and activities or public lecture series like this one, Draf is also going to publish their first publication. The debut issue will be titled Tatsulai, which means stepping out. It covers topics including how architects step out of their boundaries of the discipline into different disciplines to address issues like the pandemic or the climate crisis, etc. It also covers how people step out into the public realm to voice their concerns, and how communities step out into the communal realm to organize spaces by themselves. So if you're interested in what Draf is doing, you can log on to their website, which will also be in the chat box, to check out the events that they're going to have, and also the content of the debut issue, and also place your order on the website. So moving on to the title of our public lecture series, the reason why we are fascinated by the design process is because we think that we are being more and more exposed to fragmented information about architecture on the internet. So we hope that through this lecture series, we can shift the spotlight from picture-perfect outcomes to the exploration and experimentation that led to the decision-making process behind the creation of our built environment. So this session, we will be focusing on public buildings and urban politics. First, I would like to just state the notion of public and private, right? Public is something that is related or involves people in general. So it involves everyone rather than being limited to a particular group of people. Whereas private refers to something that belongs or is for the use of one particular person or group of people only. So the question today is like, how do we deal with this distinction, or rather, how do we blur the boundary between public and private while maintaining the necessary distance between them? How do we deal with how do we blend them but then keep it at an appropriate distance. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our speaker today, Inge Goudsmit. Inge is an assistant professor at the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And before that, she was also an associate at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, OMA, where she designed many projects, including the Taipei Performing Arts Center, for the past 12 years. So I'm going to pass the floor to Inge from here. Hi, Inge.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for coming.
It's a real big honor to be speaking for a Malaysian crowd and potentially also people elsewhere in the world. So I'm really, really happy to be here today. Thank you to Queenie, who actually was my former student a long time ago, although of course we're all still very young. But yeah, it's really nice to keep contact over like so many years. And you know, thank you so much for inviting me. I really I'm very happy to join you today. I wish I could join in person actually, but that unfortunately is difficult because it would take me about a month at least to move in and out and quarantine in and out. So I don't think that's a good idea. So luckily we can also share in this way. So also please feel free to ask me questions. It's up to Queenie how to organize this. But you know, feel free to interact, to kind of turn on your camera, ask me questions. It's all okay, because I would really like to see your faces. So let me share my screen. Can you see my screen okay?
We're seeing the presenter view though.
Oh. That's strange. Let's see if it works better like this. What do you see now?
The presenter view.
Still?
Yeah.
It's strange. It worked before, right?
Yeah, it worked just now.
How about now?
Yep, now it works.
Now it works, wonderful. I mean, otherwise I do without, but good. Well, let me quickly introduce yourself. Already, thank you for your kind introduction, Queenie. Just to give you a little bit of background, I studied in the Netherlands. I got my master in Delft. I'm a registered architect there. I worked there for a couple of years. And I worked mostly at OMA, also at some other firms in between. First in Rotterdam, and later in 2009, we opened an office here in Hong Kong. Basically because we had two projects. One is a cultural district in Hong Kong. Another one is the Taipei Performing Arts Center, which is what I will be addressing today. And to save you from me repeating Taipei Performing Arts Center over and over and over again, I will be addressing TPEC. So think 2PEC, TPEC, so you have that link. So I left OMA about a year and a half ago to become an assistant professor here at the Chinese University. At the same time, I'm writing a PhD, which actually also involves the TPEC as a case study. So I sort of continue, and I'm still also involved with OMA just to finish this project. So it's been about 12 years indeed that I worked on this project. In those years and before, actually, I also traveled a lot. I did fortunately more than just this project. And you know, Malaysia has actually been one of my favorite countries. And to be honest, that's one of the places that I miss most now that we're not allowed or not able to travel. I worked in many places in Asia because I've been in Asia since 2007. I traveled a lot in this region, also did some exchange programs all over the world, and practiced mostly in Asia and in Europe. My most recent event was indeed in the World Urban Forum in KL. You might have participated or maybe not, but it was really fun. So that was the last time that I was there. I just found this picture. A little bit about OMA, because today I will speak as a sort of formerly OMA, with a formerly OMA head. I worked on many projects there in those 12 or 15 years in total, I believe, that I have really thoroughly enjoyed. I always worked on the Taipei Performing Arts Center as a sort of key project, but other projects include the renovation of the Yulin Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, one of the major art centers, and a master plan for Tencent for 80,000 staff and 20,000 residents here in Shenzhen. Unicorn Island, also another master plan in Chengdu. The riverbanks of the Wuhan Yangtze River before the whole COVID thing happened. So I actually went there quite a few times. Projects in Vietnam. And that sort of, I was very interested in the politics around these projects. Also in the design, of course, but also, you know, how much you need to know as an architect to make these projects happen, which is in fact much more than good design. Of course, good design is essential, but you know, there's so much politics, especially in larger master plans, which is why I enjoyed master plans a lot. And that's the reason also that I started teaching. And here I teach the Urban Politics Studio, where we try to address these kind of issues. So we look at much more than design. And that has led so far to quite a few very interesting results that you're also happy to, you can check our website that is currently being updated, I believe. Again, Taipei Performing Arts Center, let's talk about that project today. And what I will show you is quite a range of slides. I have quite a few. And because the project has been, we started the competition in 2009, or won the competition in 2009, I should say. And since then, a lot has happened. So now we're about to complete it with quite a few years of delay that I had never expected that it would take so long. So I want to show you a bit of the design and a bit of the current state. And I have thrown in a few special moments about kind of the more interior part of the design, because I know a lot of you are potentially also interested in that. So let me start with the site area. Can you see my mouse if I move it like this? Yeah. So this is actually the site area, which is, this is the metro line, the Jiantan station. It's in the north of Taipei in Shilin area. And this area is very famous for its night market, which is mostly this area. It's a very old night market, one of the oldest in Taipei, and has always been extremely lively. And you know, it brings a lot of local people, a lot of tourists. For a couple of years, a lot of mainland tourists. More recently, a lot of Malaysian and also Korean tourists. And most recent, of course, zero tourists because of COVID. So it's suffering, this area is suffering a lot. But nevertheless, so we found our site in a sort of sea of activity. It's always, especially in the evening, it's an extremely active site. And we felt we were very lucky that you know, we had this activity on the site even before we start designing. We looked at, you know, the existing night market. It was a temporary night market on that parking lot that I showed you, which on one sense was very messy. On the other hand, we sort of realized that it's a very highly efficient space. So everything is organized. There's a huge variety of food, and everything was sort of, you know, quite organized. If you see the plan, you realize, you know, within all that messiness, there's actually a structured plan. So rather than to take away this night market, we thought we should keep it. It would be such a pity to take it away, which is what the government asked us to do. And basically place a new theater on top of of that night market. And this, I want to contrast to this this project is the plan of the National Theater by Paul Andreu in Beijing, that was built a few years before the competition started. And what you see here is basically three completely separate realms of the front of house and the back of house. And there's basically the fact that there's three theaters all together can hardly be noticed when you're inside. So we thought, if we have those 3 theaters, we should really try to benefit as much as we can from that combination of theaters, which is quite an exciting program. So we took sort of reference to this hot pot, a Taiwanese hot pot, as a diagram of consolidation and efficiency, where we say three dishes are cooked in one pot. Can we also, with our program of 3 theaters, can we sort of combine and be highly efficient about this space? So this is the program brief, 3 different theaters: the Grand Theater with 1,500 seats, a proscenium playhouse with 800 seats, and a multiform theater with another 800 seats or maximum. And we consolidated those 3 theaters basically into a sort of stage tower, which is a kind of very efficient back of house tower. And then those volumes that are sticking out of the cube are the auditoriums. With this, we try to create much higher value and also flexibility. And we try to reduce the redundancy of those multiple back of house areas. And in fact, multiple front of house areas, because this way you can combine the entrance area to the theater. So it results in a very compact theater that also leaves as much space on the ground as possible. And I will tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is then that image. This is a render of that space placed in the site. So this cube is, we wanted to make it a very kind of highly visual cube where you can see through, you can see the sort of machine in operation, and then with those kind of auditorium volumes that are really a bit mysterious, and you cannot really understand what's happening inside. So it looks very different from most theaters, I would say, that are usually quite opaque volumes. This is a real picture. It's, as you can see, it's almost done, but you also see that actually the site is still closed off. This is very recent, in the last few weeks. And here you see, how the kind of the night market or the food areas, the food stalls are happening around that space. And we are very happy about that. We think that life on the site is actually really exciting. The government occasionally thinks otherwise, because they also are concerned about dirt and messiness. So they would like to control the food market a little bit better and those vendors. But I won't tell you too much about that today. That's not the topic of the lecture, but I'm quite interested in this combination between the sort of local culture, which is really very strong, and the high culture that is implemented as a sort of global icon that is placed in this very sort of local neighborhood, and how these 2 areas clash. Also, it doesn't always work. Local people are a little bit concerned. They don't really know what this building is. The fact that the construction took much longer than expected also makes them a bit miserable, and they want it to be done, and then they will see if they're gonna like it or not. At the moment, they're very they're hopeful that it will be interesting, but they're a bit curious whether they will actually be able to connect to these spaces. So what we really try to do is kind of open up that the site in order to connect to, and give space to this local culture. And that's why we lifted up the building. As I mentioned, initially we had a food market, which is this kind of wider, this lower strip. But unfortunately, this was taken away by the government after a couple of months into our design exercise, because they had fears of management of, again, dirt and smell, etc., into the theater. And also the combination of those different types of cultures, if you will, high culture and local culture, they thought was actually quite difficult to match. And this has been a struggle throughout, which is actually part of my of the PhD that I'm working on. I'm looking into that kind of struggle. Nevertheless, by reducing the site area as much as possible, there will be a lot of area for other activities, and whether they are related to theater or related to food, we will have to see. And eventually, as architects, of course, we don't have control over that. So definitely, it will be a new attractor in this very dense urban energy. It will attract probably different kind of people. We also, at the moment, everybody hopes that it will help to sort of save the night market after tourists will come back, because the night market is really in a very poor state because of COVID and also because of some other problems that they had even before. This is the view from the MTR. So we made an underpass from the MTR up to the site, so you don't have to go through to cross the street. And you start to see already part of that kind of underbelly of the big ball of that auditorium. And this is one of our renders. And then the kind of initial or the current situation as still a construction site, but you really see already that the boundary between outside and inside is actually quite vague, right? It's the exterior material goes all the way inside with those strips. And that reminds me to the introduction slide that Queenie showed earlier, this boundary between the public and the private. And of course, this is a public building, but it's still sort of private. It's closed off in the night, for example. But we really tried in several different ways to blur that boundary, because I believe if you make a public building, you have to make an effort to make it as public as possible. So here you see a sort of ground floor plan. And this entire area in front is covered by the building. And also here, these areas, they are where the auditoriums are protruding. So you see there's a lot of sort of shaded, covered area of the site that is yet sort of part of the realm of the theater. And then at some point you go inside of the theater, which is potentially should be open the entire day. So again, accessible for anybody. And at some point you start to go up into the theater with this kind of big staircase. And then step by step, you sort of enter into the realm of the theater, and also the materials step by step get more and more advanced. So this is the second floor, which is the main lobby and mostly used for visitors. This is probably not a ticketed area necessarily, but it's probably an area that the general visitors won't visit so much because it's simply a sort of type of space. And then this is from that lobby, you basically start entering. This is the picture that I showed just now, and you start entering the different theaters. So it's really the kind of main zone before you start going up to the theater. And the first one is to the Grand Theater, the largest with 1,500 seats, where you enter basically this staircase. And Rem Koolhaas, when we were doing a site visit, he once mentioned that this must be the longest staircase in the history of architecture, or at least it should have that effect, because it sort of tapers all the way up. It becomes narrower and narrower. So eventually you have a very, very small slit. Of course, you don't only have to walk, there's also escalators that are taking you up, and at the end of the show, taking you down. But it's quite an expressive, interesting space. The interior of that Grand Theater has basically 2 floors, as you see, and one of the floors is connected because we didn't want to have 2 sort of balcony and a main floor, but by kind of creating that combination, we ensured that the two levels are really connected to each other. Here you see the plan, and it makes it into a very intimate feeling. So even though it's 1,500 seats, you still have the feeling that you're very close to the stage. So this is one of the furthest points as a render. An image to the other side, where we also at the back have a slit of daylight, again to make the performing arts spaces much more interesting, so to practice during the day. And this is a recent picture of what that space looks like. So it's quite similar to the render, which sometimes is a good thing, sometimes is a bit scary. And you of course you hope that the real image looks better than the rendered image in general. So here you see, I mean, this is a very similar image to that earlier render. And it's a very exciting space because of this blueness, and we'll say a little bit more about that. But first, the multiform theater, which is on the other side of basically of the cube. And this is a multiform theater, which means there's a lot of different configurations possible. And well, you see, this is of course the interior of the theater with the technical grid in the top and a sort of functional space with some understage underneath. But then you see this space, which is the lobby. And initially our lobby was only here. and we didn't really include this space underneath, which was the realm of the MEP engineers at the time. But then we realized that they didn't quite need all that space, and that we could take some of it back, and that it would actually benefit to create a slightly larger lobby to this multiform theater. So we started to take over some of their space. And of course, there must be some ducts, and we accepted those ducts and even constructed one duct into a sort of bar. So you can order your drinks on top of that, one of those effective working ducts. And we also liked the contrast between that very low space and that very high space that suddenly has a roof light, as you see here in that image. So suddenly you have the full height of a 50-meter high or 20-meter high space, which is quite exciting, I think, to experience. This is the plan with some different configurations, and the current situation where, again, the theater is blue, but a different tone of blue, a darker color of blue, because the multiform theater was the client wanted to have it kind of darker, because that would make it slightly more similar to a black box. There's a big story about that, and I'll show you one slide later on to go into a little bit more detail. But most interesting about these two theaters is that we can actually combine them. So sometimes I call this 1 and 1 is 3. So instead of having two separate theaters, this would be the grand theater realm with a stage tower in the understage, the auditorium, the backstage, and the main stage. And this would be the multiform theater. But we can combine those stages together and thereby create a 100-meter long area from this side all the way to that side, in which you can imagine sort of completely new types of performances. And as I know that you guys are also building or designing a theater, this is something that could be very interesting to consider, how you can make not a conventional theater, but you can really create something new. We showed sometimes the reference of the opera Die Soldaten, which is an opera that needs a lot of space and can currently only be performed in sort of factory halls, which you must know everything about by now. But we also thought it was interesting to try to address this kind of different types of shows. And honestly, in Taiwan, there's a very high level of theater, very high quality. So it was interesting for us to kind of address that interest. So this is a few views of how that space works. And here you see kind of from the multiform theater, the backstages, and then all the way to the grand theater, that 100-meter long space under construction, which sometimes we feel we should not build any walls anymore because it's so exciting to have that empty space rather than to have those full spaces. The last theater, Proscenium Playhouse, is the big ball, as most people understand it. Again, you enter from that lobby area into basically a big tube by long escalators. And in reality, these escalators look actually much better, fortunately, than in the renders. You must realize that the renders are about 10 years old. And 10 years ago, I mean, the quality was just a little bit different. That's something that we didn't realize at the time, but looking back, yeah, you can see some of them, they look a little bit boring, right? So here you see the section through that space, the interior circle, interior bowl, and then an exterior bowl. And in between those two volumes, you basically have the moment where that entails the lobby at the bottom and the sort of circulation spaces where you circulate to your seats in the different boxes on the higher levels. So this is that lobby area where this is where the tube comes out. And this is the actual situation where you see the sort of underbelly, the soffit of the auditorium. And it's a really sexy space that, you don't quite understand how it works when you stand inside, but it's a sort of inviting space to walk up those big staircases. And this is how you circulate. Of course, some work needs to be done in those spaces to make them, but it will always be quite dark because there's no daylight until you eventually enter into the theater. So this is the theater plan with 800 seats, a render. and the current existing situation. And at some point we started unpacking those seats. So it's quite, we built the proscenium also as a circular opening, for which we had to fight a lot. It's not a standard proscenium. We're actually designing special curtains to match this proscenium, so we can really play it out and kind of make the most out of it. But here, those black areas are the official proscenium opening that can open up in different ways. As you might, I'm not sure if you guys have a proscenium theater inside of your stage, but then this is sort of reference to understand. And you see here the seats are finally uncovered. And another view from one of the boxes. The seats we actually designed from scratch. These are just 16 of the design versions. We had many, many more. We actually built them with the program Pepakura. We would cut them out of paper initially because we had no budget to really develop it. At some point we started developing it together with the seating manufacturer because it's actually quite difficult to develop a seat from scratch. We discovered through this very, very long process. And we wanted to, or we needed to have a sliding mechanism because we didn't want to have a folding seat, and otherwise you have not enough egress width for fire, etc. It's a very, a theater is a very highly technical space. So eventually we're very happy that these seats are there. I must say they are actually quite comfortable, more so for Asian people that tend to be slightly less fat than potential some Westerners. Because they are not extremely wide, but this is really, the max we could do in so many different ways. So it was a really exciting kind of experience to work with those seats. Something about the material, you must have noticed that all the theaters are completely blue. And this picture was actually one of the pictures that we used as a reference. We thought it was really exciting that this boat, it's by Xavier Velhan, and everything about it is white, except for a few very technical things that are either black or white. Everything about it is blue, of course. So we thought this could be very exciting. We started looking for references, marine boats and kind of submarines that have a similar quality, but also this kind of layer of material that's instead of using a top layer, we really tried to have this idea of everything sort of coated in a very thick coating of the same color. Initially, we proposed 3 different colors for the 3 different theaters, 3 different shades, and also different sort of textures that we wanted to explore. From a very lush in the Grand Theater to the PP, the Ball Theater, with a very this kind of thick coat that could be applied on the ball, and eventually the sort of darker color for the MT, the multiform theater. And we did a lot of tests. Some of the colors were too desaturated, some were too innocent, some were too political, which, if you know a little bit about Taiwan, is extremely important. Then we had a lot of discussions with our client and with the theater performers, who were very afraid of that this color would be too light or too dark or too innocent or too political or something else. So we had to actually make a mock-up in one of the local theaters in Taipei, where I literally traveled from Hong Kong with, I don't know, like 800 meters of fabric that we installed in this theater. An event, like we invited the entire theater elites of Taiwan, and eventually the colors were approved to our big happiness. But it was a very long process. So again, I mentioned urban politics, and it's, you can design something, you can come up with something is one thing, but then to actually make it work is a whole different thing. And up to the color, as I wanted to show, things can be extremely political. We have, I believe, about 145 different materials in this theater. that were all specified. It's a public project, so you need to be much more careful. You cannot have one specific material supplier, but you need to prove that the material can be either produced or supplied by at least 3 different suppliers in order to have equality, and make sure that we don't prefer a single supplier. So it was an enormous amount of work to first for us to supply and source all these materials, and then for the contractor to sort of match all these materials, because they had to get approval from us, including from REM, of course, to have all those materials, the alternatives that they proposed, the cheaper alternatives, the local alternatives, etc. But eventually we made it. This is a picture of the archive of the materials that we had at the office, which is really, a huge amount of material, a huge amount of work that's, kind of a small team of 3 or 4 people spent several years to kind of put this together. Another topic, the public loop. A public loop is a sort of public area, public walk that goes through the entire building. And it's a space that we discovered only once we finished the concept design and once we won the competition. And it was literally because we were so excited about the big spaces that theaters have that usually people will never be able to see. So we said, can we not come up with this kind of route that people can walk through the building and actually experience a lot of different types of back of house. So we managed to kind of find space through nooks and crooks of the building, starting from the lobby with its own entrance from outside. So it's separate from the theater, going up behind the back of house areas, peeking into some of the stage areas here, and also here into the technical grid of the multiform theater, further up through the offices, through a courtyard, and to this kind of public space that is a viewing deck and accessible to everybody. Great outdoor space from where you have a beautiful view. A last kind of view through the proscenium playhouse where you can see onto the stage. And then you would go back by elevator from here. Again, this is the render, and very fortunately, the real situation is much more exciting than that. Again, of course, in process, but it's a really exciting space that, I was talking recently to a local social activist who had her doubts about the application of this building and how well it would suit local people. But she called this space, she had picked up on it already, and she said, yeah, there's this tiny alley that really reminds me of the local alleys of Taipei's kind of back of house spaces, or Taipei's little alleys. And she called it the tiny alley that goes through the entire corridor. And I believe, I really hope that this will be a space that will be opened to the public, that will not only be used for kind of guided tours, hopefully also not paid, but of course, again, the client is eventually in charge, and as architects we can come up with ideas, we can propose things, and then we need to see if how things work out and if it works at all. So this is the big the public loop escalator that goes through the auditorium, and here this is basically an image that we made very early on, where we wanted to have that view of the back of house areas, that is where you can sort of see what's happening. And we tested many different colors. I just show you a few, but eventually this red color was selected. In some cases, we, some of the theater elites were quite critical of these spaces because they were afraid that we would give away the entire show. So we said, no, we would just give a little slit, and we will even provide curtains that if you really need to test in private, you can close the curtains. But of course, we hope that often it will be opened. And then also a lot of mostly younger performers, they said, well, but it's also an opportunity for us to show to the public, rather than to have a poster, to show them some preview of what we are trying to test with our performers. So let's see how this works out, but we are quite excited that actually the client eventually accepted it. This is the view to the MT technical grid. So this is a space that most people have never seen before in their lives, right? Then the public loop leads up to this cafe on the 7th floor. Cafe is open to the visitors, to everybody in the public loop, but also to the theater performers and to the people who work in the building, which is actually a very, very large amount of people, often forgotten. If you think of theater, you think of performers and audience, but there's hundreds of people that work in the building can also have their lunch here. So we really hope that this will be a space where people can meet formally or informally. And this is the space, the interior, as it is at the current stage. There's a large terrace that you can access also. And again, the planting is in progress. And this is then that viewing deck that I mentioned earlier, all the way on top. And again, the current image looks a little bit better than the render, fortunately. It's a very exciting space that also has a lot of structure that we needed to accept through it. And then there's this view of the Chiang Kai-shek hotel, which is really one of the major touristic spaces or important cultural spaces in this area, and can only be seen from a certain height. So we're quite excited that you can actually have a view. To be really honest, we did not know that we would have this view. We always photoshopped it into the initial renders. You see it here, but we had no clue from which angle you would see it. So we were very happy once the space was stopped out that we could actually see the theater. It was a big luck in a way. Sometimes you have to have some luck. And then this is the view from the public loop, the viewing deck into that, or the Performing Arts Center, the big ball into that space. And here is the current situation. Do I still have time to talk? Maybe I quickly go through a few facade slides.
Yep, there's time.
Yeah, okay. So facades are, of course, sort of an extra project, a project in and of itself, so like the chairs were that, and like the interiors were that. We have basically three major types of facades: the glass cube, which we really wanted to show sort of what is happening inside of the technical building. Then aluminum facades on the auditoriums, and the kind of back of house west towers that have a lot of back of house areas. So these are mock-ups, and Queenie asked me, like, can you show some of the mock-ups? Well, these mock-ups are almost complete buildings, right? They have their own drawing set, and are extremely, they're I think 50 meters high or something, where we tested all the essential points of the different facades. So that, of course, the ball that we had to test, and especially how the point would come together, the glass facade, and also how the ball and the glass facade connect, and then the kind of straight flat aluminum facade. We had numerous meetings. This was on a different site somewhere far away, where we had an endless amount. We had fire people coming in to make the building wet so we could see it. We had to come in sunny weather so we could see if it would shine too much. We had, I think, maybe 8 different versions because constantly we didn't approve on the different joints, etc. So it was a huge kind of technical process, but eventually it sort of paid off. And yeah, these are some of the mock-up pictures. We had to decide whether it's shiny or matte, how exactly we grind the welds, etc. I won't go into too much detail. And eventually the flat panels were all hand grinded, as you see here, literally people with hand machines, grinding machines that made these patterns, because we wanted to make them as lively as possible. Unlike, for example, the apple facades that are very, very matte, very constant. We wanted to create this kind of life. So here you see the hand grinding of all those machines in a particular pattern. We had to educate those chefs to actually do it in the way that we envisioned it. So this is a view of the theater itself. What we did not expect was that halfway, basically the construction of this ball, our contractor went bankrupt and the site was closed for 2 years. Now you can imagine that had an enormous impact and was actually really scary for us. And this is something that you can never envision. you can design perfectly, but you always, I remember that we said, well, it's a difficult process, but they just need to do their best. And then your site closes for 2 years, and just doing your best is no longer kind of an option because nobody is getting paid. So those were hard times for the theater. I won't go into too much detail, but just a few pictures of what it looks like. And you see the overall bigger joints, and you see the smaller joints that are welded together, and kind of how it comes together. And eventually, I believe it worked out pretty well, knowing that some of these panels are 17 by 13 by 8 meters or something like that. They're enormous. So it's not so easy to get them perfectly in shape. Nothing is perfect, and it's never meant to be perfect. You see some of those lines which were of course not part of our design, but you also sometimes have to accept the way that it came out, and we are at least quite excited. We have corrugated glass. The big benefit of corrugated glass is that you don't need mullions, because the glass can basically stand by itself. Right? If you consider a flat piece of paper, of course it cannot stand, but if you would fold it, then suddenly it has the strength to stand by itself. And that means it's much more transparent than it would be if you have mullions. So we had this glass, it's actually made in Spain and shipped to the site. And gives this very, very interesting effect, both from outside and also if you look through the glass. And we always joked that this glass made Taiwan look a little bit more like Hong Kong, with suddenly you have all those pencil towers and the background, the hills. But it's a very exciting kind of effect that really changes the perspective on the city. Lastly, the back of house areas. This is the model that actually decided how we wanted to perforate these different buildings. You see different types, different sizes of perforations, which reflect the different functions inside. The larger are sort of social functions. There's dressing rooms and there's office functions that all require a kind of different amount of light. And then there's the closed functions, which is the closed panels, which are completely lifts or other back of house areas that don't require any light. So we had those different kind of perforations, and we decided to literally take this model because we tested so many different things, and eventually this model is what we liked. So the current building looks exactly the same as this model. Again, it's another sort of, you have to be a bit lucky that at some point you hit the right spot and you're happy with the kind of design that comes out. I must tell you, of course, this is done by a very large team. So this is the kind of design team, including our structural engineers, our local architects, which were extremely important to include the local codes and building codes, because of course a building like this doesn't comply with all the standard codes, and you need to find ways out. We worked with Arab Fire, with Arab Structure, with local MEP engineers, so a very large team. We had several site visits. At some point, Toyo Ito, who I'm sure you're aware, did the other theater in a different city in Taipei, in Taiwan. He came to our site. We all went to see his site, which was really fun to kind of compare the different areas. And then what we enjoy is also to see how local people respond to this building. So this we found already a while ago, a postcard painted by a local artist, which is actually printed in many different ways, including on one building facade. We were, for a while, we were a Poke Gym. Although I didn't play Pokemon, I was very proud to be a Poke Gym in our building. And this is basically the major nickname that we have gotten from the people in Taipei, the century egg tofu, which is a very famous dish, and you can sort of imagine why we got that name. Reviews are not always positive. This is one of the vloggers that has been getting a lot of followers. This is one of the mock images that we actually enjoy very much. And another one. But eventually, this building, let's see what will happen to it when it's really opening. The opening will most likely, but I never dare to say that it will happen, but I hope that it will happen next summer, July 2022, with probably a month of celebrations. And after that, the real shows will start. And as you can probably imagine, I really hope that I can go there because after working on this project for 12 years, I'm very curious to see the kind of final results with my own eyes, as we say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inge. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. You guys can also just come if you have questions, okay? But while waiting for questions from the audience, maybe I can ask a question first. So this is such a huge project, right? And like as we went through your presentation, there's this consideration about the urban impact on the local markets to the scale of designing the choosing the materials or designing the chairs. I was wondering, how was the process like when you have to deal with different scales? Do you go inside out or outside in, or is it more of a back and forth process?
Yeah, I think it's really a back and forth. The first design considerations, I mean, I think there's probably 500, if not 1,000 models of this building that started in very, very early design stages. Of course, this was a different time. 12 years ago, the computer programs were not as efficient as they are now. So we worked a lot with models to kind of configure the theaters. And I guess we started with the brief. The theaters have a very specific shape, in particular the back of house area. And we basically started cutting them out as a 3D shape to try to mix and match them together. And again, I think there were probably 300 different versions of how to mix and match those theaters together. And every time after, we have several options, we share them with REM and with other partners and get feedback on what they think is the right direction. In particular, REM has been always very involved in this project and still is, despite his not so young age anymore. Of course, he's not old yet, but he's halfway his 70s, I believe, or a little bit further than halfway. So he's always been more a crit than a kind of designer, and that's how OMA works. So we as a team, we proposed options, and then he responded to that. And by so many different iterations of the same, and every time we got one step further, and he said, oh, that's an interesting form. Let's keep working a little bit more. And then we tested another 5 options, another 10, another 20, and send it back to him. And then again, he said, well, let's go direction A and B and forget about the rest. So time by time, again, it was an iterative process. And in this, of course, you look at the model, but you also constantly test from inside. So you saw a lot of 3D tests. And what we started from very, very early on is to say we always take the same render angle. So you see some of the images are very bad, but you always have a good comparison. If you start with, let's say 20 different angles, then you can keep following up. And up till now, we have a photographer who has been taking photos during the entire construction of those same angles. So we actually see literally our renders turning into reality, as I showed several times in this talk. Yeah, so inside and outside at the same time and following up.
Okay, you want to ask yourself? Hang on, the student has a question.
Great. Hi.
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 Can I ask, as we know the town is quiet, quite Taiwan.
Sorry, yeah. You don't have to. Just the sound.
Yeah, I have a question about, as we know the town is quite like a bit old. So what is your intention to have extraordinary building at there?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. I'm sorry.
As we know, the town, the area is quite a bit old and a bit Taiwan style. So what is the intention to have extraordinary the building the TPAC at there?
Very good question, actually. So this is, of course, this is a decision not made by the architect, right? It comes forth from a master plan, by a cultural master plan by the city officials, and there was one lady in the she was at the time the head of the Department of Cultural Affairs, and she had this idea to instead of only kind of compress all the major cultural buildings, if you will, in the urban center. I'm not sure if Taipei has a real urban center. It's a polycentric city with kind of Japanese buildup. But this, it's definitely not where most cultural buildings are in the Shulin area. So part of the consideration was to bring more tourism and kind of to bring more economy in that sense to this area. On the other hand, it was also just to find a piece of land that is large enough for a large auditorium or a large theater. That is actually not so easy to find. The government owns several sites, but this is quite a large site, so you need to have that accessibility. And the interesting thing about this site is that it actually used to be a river, and that river was due to a lot of floods in the 70s. They closed the river, and in the 80s, 90s, they developed a new master plan. And initially, this site was part of the school. And in this picture, this last picture, let me share the screen again. In this last picture, you see the schoolyard basically right next to the theater, which is a very awkward situation, right? Which school has a theater right next to it? So it was never really intended like that, but at some point she found this site. And the big benefit is that it's of course close to or right next to the MTR station, which means you can try to encourage people to really take MTR. And thereby, so it's part of a kind of larger cultural master plan to include, to bring people here, to include it in several other cultural facilities that are currently being constructed, and therefore to sort of redevelop this area. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is very questionable, and that it's also something that, of course, has a lot of different decisions or different backgrounds and different opinions by different people. Some local vendors are very happy about this building because they hope that it might bring new economy. There's also people that are concerned about kind of property prices going up because indeed, and that's not only because of the TPAC, but as part of this larger regeneration plan, several or quite a few new high-rises are coming up. Again, if I show that image, there's a new TOD, a transport-oriented development, that is currently being planned right behind this MTR station. And it's actually currently it's in the news every day because people are really angry about it. They say it will kind of block the view to that Chiang Kai-shek hotel. So it's very hard to build a kind of theater like this in an existing very, very local neighborhood. Let's see what it will bring. One of my interviewees recently said, well, it's going to be fine. Shulin, Shulin. And I thought that was a very nice conclusion. Queenie, I see some questions also in the chat. Do you want me to respond to those? Or do you have other people? Yeah? Okay, let me read it up. Question from John. Thank you, John. Hi, Ms. Inge. May I know if sustainability is part of the design and building process? For instance, the material selection. Why did we use for corrugated glass? Is this option a very important element that is overweighting the choice of locally available material? This is a very good question, John. Sustainability is a very large topic that needs to be addressed in every single building. I strongly believe so. How you address this is questionable. It can be done on the level of the material, or it can be done as a kind of much larger, in a much larger scale level. And part of it is, of course, sustainability as in green, let's say. But if you look at, for example, the sustainability goals that are set by the UN Habitat, they also include an inclusive city as part of the sustainability goals. So, and I think that part is much more interesting to address with a public theater like this. That indeed you try, and that's what we have been trying. Let's see if it will work out. But to try to really make this a building that that can be used by many different people, including that side area that, as you see, it's quite open. So that is a sort of way that we have addressed the sustainability issue. With material coming from different areas, our client would be was very keen on sourcing, in particular, the glass locally in Taiwan. And there's very clear benefits to that. Mostly if a pane of glass breaks, it's much easier to ship or to bring in a new pane of glass. On the other hand, this glass is so specific that it's not something that is made or it needs to be made to order, right? It's not something that you have in stock. So there are actually quite a few glass panes in stock, maybe a few % extra somewhere at a different site that can be installed if one of the planes breaks. But we decided not to go with local material in this case because it was simply the quality was not good enough. And then you lose so much material with testing and with potential breakage that eventually it seemed like a better idea to work with a supplier that we were certain that could really do the job. So it's a very important question that I believe always needs to be addressed, but I do believe there's different ways to addressing such a question. That, you know, it's good to look at the different debates that are happening around this climate change. It would be interesting to do a lecture series only about those different debates, in fact. I hope that answers your question. Maybe because I also see Clarissa's or Queenie, you have a different.
Students are having questions here.
Yeah.
Can you explain the acoustic of the theater consideration?
Also, a very good question. Acoustics are extremely important. And for every theater, it's a challenge, no matter what. For if you want to have a theater where the two auditoriums are literally, you know, back to back, it's a much larger challenge. And that's what we are facing, of course, because we want to have those two halls that can be open to each other and closed. So what we did, and maybe I should quickly go to one of the sections to explain that a little bit more. So I would say there's a kind of generic, difficult question of, let me show you this, a generic question, and then there's, you know, the disconnect between these two halls. And you must imagine that Miss Saigon, I don't know if you guys know that opera, but it's an opera that has a helicopter. And the sound of a helicopter is about 125 or 115 to 125 dB, which is about the loudest noise that you can imagine because it's a very low tone. And you want to be able to show Miss Saigon, the opera, in this hall, while at the same time performing another show in the multiform theater. And that means there needs to be at least double layer of very high quality sliding doors in between. And what we did with those sliding doors, we actually took it as a sort of challenge to make different configurations possible. So you see these dashed lines, and those are the different locations where those different where those sliding walls can go. So that means that instead of only having one configuration for this auditorium, you can also extend it up to here, and you can even make it into an L shape. So that would give you a completely new type of theater, or much more experience, different types of experience for that multiform theater. And the same with this the Grand Theater, where you can actually have a very large backstage if so required. Plus, you can have a sort of theater in the round if you combine all these backstage areas. So it gives us a lot of flexibilities. We will see how it will work out, because we know that this is a big challenge. And for sure, there will be questions at some point that come back. The acoustic tests are happening as we speak in these couple of weeks. There's been acoustic tests before, but the problem with acoustics is that you can only test once the project is basically finished, because otherwise, of course, you would have so much structural leakage that it wouldn't make sense anyways. And the problem is, once the project is finished, it's very difficult to access areas that, or even see areas that might have issues. For example, if connections that are supposed to be disconnected from each other and probably have rubber in between, for example, if they are still, for some reason, connected, if there's a mistake, it's almost impossible to find those mistakes. So during the construction, we had a team of structural engineers or acoustic engineers that came regularly to the site and checked together with us if they're doing the right thing. The contractor is eventually responsible, and they need to make sure that it works the way we are asking them to work. But it's a difficult process. Besides that, of course, you see that on this plan that in most cases we have a double layer, so a double box from inside to outside, because also the sound of airplanes, for example, outside, of course, you don't want to hear when you're inside sitting in a performance. So it's a difficult and very, very expensive consideration with a lot of technical solutions and a lot of headaches throughout the process.
Inge, how much time do you have left? You have a next meeting to go to.
I'm okay. I have about 10-15 more minutes.
Okay.
Even, I mean, I can come a little bit late. I'm teaching studio, so my students, I'm sure they will accept it if I come a few minutes late, if I talk to other students, right?
Okay. Then maybe we can address Clarissa's question. She says, "Hi Inge, thank you for your presentation. Just a very general question. After working on a project for 12 years, you yourself shifting from architect into a more academic role, what's the biggest takeaway, and what was the biggest challenge, or even the most indignant, annoying pet peeve of a project spanning so long?"
Well, good question. First of all, hi Clarissa. She was my student too. So it's very happy that she's joining from a distance. A very good question. 12 years is extremely long. I remember around the time that I was teaching actually Queenie and Larissa, which was I think 2011, 2012 or something. That's when I took over the lead of this project, and I was told it would take another 3 years. So the building was supposed to be finished in 2015. And then it took a little bit longer. So I said, okay, I'll stay a little bit longer. And then it took a little bit longer again. And at some point, I mentioned it briefly, the contractor went bankrupt, which was very unfortunate and took us basically a 2-year delay, because it's quite difficult to get to get back on track. So I kept working on this project, but at the same time, I also started to develop a sort of academic profile. So I decided to do an extra additional master. I had an architectural master for a long time, but I took a master in public policy. And I sort of started preparing my academic profile because after so many years of working intensely, I also like to reflect. I believe now, maybe it's also because I will probably not be able to do another building that is this cool and this intense. Public buildings like this don't happen so often in the current state of economy. It's something that even within OMA is quite difficult to get. Also, the amount of resources that we could spend as an office on this project is, I don't think would be possible anymore. So very exciting and very, very annoying as well, because it just took so long. And, I told you 145 different materials, and internally we had probably 10 different material samples for each. So that's, something like 1,500 different material samples, if not more. And then we had to go through the same process with the contractor. Again, another maybe not quite as many, but definitely a few hundred material samples that we all needed to see and needed to approve. So it's a tough process, I have to say. And it's I have a colleague who is on site. She has been also in the project since the beginning. And to her, it's even tougher, I think, because she's there every day. Of course, it's amazing to see, but it's like a child that grows very, very slowly. In fact, I had 2 children during the process of this entire building, and yeah, it's at some point I remember Rem proposed that I would get married on top of this building, and I would have my wedding party there. And I got married relatively late, but I didn't wait for this building to finish, right? So it's really been a long, an important part of my life, but that at the same time also a very exciting part. I got the chance to visit Taipei something like 60 or 80 times. I don't know how many times I traveled. At some point I went every 2 weeks from Hong Kong, and to connect to people there. And as you know, I'm still working on this project. I still continue it, but then from a sort of academic perspective, where I try to find a way to kind of evaluate how such buildings should be evaluated, not only as a sort of building, as a sort of, what is the meaning, what is the image that people have if they see this building, but how does it relate to the surroundings. And particularly because this site is quite particular, it's not a kind of standard theater site, it's really inner city, very busy area. So it's even more important that this building connects to the site. And as an academic, we also have the liberty of being critical. So I'm also critical in that sense of certain decisions that we made, hoping that we can learn from this in the future with kind of different projects. So yeah, love and hate, the combination.
I'm going to ask a question. Is there any other facilities inside the building except the cafe?
Other
facilities.
Other facilities. Yeah, so there, we have a whole series of, so from ground floor up, I mentioned the site. The site area is actually quite large and has the opportunity to host a lot of different events. I mentioned before that we tried to have that food court as a kind of podium, which was taken away. And after it was taken out, we opened up that entire site. And we have always sort of envisioned that the market could continue here with the vendors. So we try to implement at least provisions. The client was more interested in a sort of tourist market. We were more interested in a kind of more local food market, because this tourist market doesn't really help to embed the space into the local site. So that is sort of the first level of facility that we hope will really connect to the surroundings. Then there's the cafe that I mentioned as part of that public loop, and also that viewing deck where everybody can go. There's a whole series of rehearsal rooms, 6 in total, that we're not sure. It depends mostly on the management and the operation of the building. They could be used either by local theater performance groups, but they could also be used by, for example, the high school next door, or kind of different ballet and performing arts groups that could hopefully use this building. But again, it's a matter of operation. So those are the major facilities that are either already open to the public or will be open to the public.
Okay, there's another question from John. It's related to material selection. So does the local government put a requirement such as building materials must be sourced at a certain percentage in order to also help with the local economy?
Interesting question. Yeah. No, there was no percentage, although it's clear that it's always preferred to have locally sourced building materials. What is interesting in Taiwan is, in fact, that there's not necessarily a rule that doesn't allow, or that forces you to use Taiwanese produced materials, because there is a certain limitation. Taiwan is actually quite small, right? but then there's it's partially lifted now, but especially when we started, there was a maximum amount of material, and initially it was actually not allowed to import any material directly from mainland China for obvious political reasons. So that was a very big challenge, because in this area, of course, and I'm sure Malaysia, it's similar. A lot of material is imported from mainland China. So there were some, there's ways around it where you can have a material sourced from China, shipped to Hong Kong or another place, and operated on somehow finished, for example, and then shipped further to Taiwan. But this is actually quite a big limitation. In general, I think the world has also developed a little bit further over those 10 years. If I would do it again, I would try to pay more attention. Like, there were occasions where things were a bit unclear. For example, there were interior tiles for our bathroom. We decided that the public bathrooms, we would have white tiles for the female bathrooms and black tiles for the male bathrooms. And we sourced, a rather generic sample of white tile and sent it to them. And eventually it turned out that that's generic sample that we thought was really, really not so special, came from Thailand, and that it was impossible to bring this type of tile to Taiwan. And at some point, even some politicians started discussing the white toilet tile. So eventually we had to pick a local Taiwanese toilet tile. And because of very, very complex regulations in public buildings and the amount of humidity that those tiles can actually absorb on the floor, very, very complex, we were not able to find really white tiles. So eventually we had to pick slightly yellow tiles that we really didn't like. So eventually we decided, let's go only for black tiles. But it meant that some of the partition walls were already ordered and installed in white, and the tiles now are black. So, this is a very detailed case of, and it shows you how difficult it is sometimes to work in this local context, and also sort of misunderstandings, because for us it was really not so important to have that tile, and the contractor already ordered that tile, a massive amount of those tiles, because you can imagine there's quite a few toilets in a building like this. And they cannot use that tile because of the regulation. So very, very complex issues that sometimes you run into and you have to solve. Speaking of headaches, this is one of them.
There's another question from Kokyong. May I know the Taipei building material procurement law? Does it influence the design decision a lot during the construction period?
Yes, it did. Again, it's very interesting to hear that you guys have such detailed questions. It means that you really understand the kind of matter that we're dealing with. I'm super excited to hear that. I don't think my students have heard of a procurement law, to be honest. So it's really great. Yes, the procurement law was, it's actually an interesting case. At some point, we had the detailed design acceptance meetings, and that was the kind of a major point in our design acceptance, where the building, the construction did not start yet, because the thing is, once you start construction for such a big site, it's much more difficult to stop it. But everything before that, things can happen. And I'm sure if you follow the news, there's so many designs that eventually don't happen. And that, of course, for an architect is a big risk, because we really want this building to be done, because we really believe that it would be very exciting, right? So the DD meetings, I believe we had 9 different expert meetings, and each, this process was about 9 months, which was additional to our schedule. It was not part of our calculations. And one of those meetings was about materials. And for most materials, we sourced them basically, and that was in collaboration with the local architect. We sourced 3 different suppliers that could supply that material. So because it's a public building, you always need to make sure that there's equality in that sourcing. But there were a few materials that were very unique, and that we couldn't find anywhere else in the world. Either they are specific to one supplier, or they're so difficult to describe, because how do you describe a fabric, right? It's quite difficult to, we have drawn fabrics, we have drawn the distance of the pills, and we have, specified the amount of knots and the amount of connections in the sublayer, etc. But it's really difficult to do that, and it's simply not always possible to have a specific mohair, for example, that we use on the seats in the theater, to have that specific mohair sourced by 3 different suppliers, because, as you know, you have to be very aware that a contractor will always try to go for the cheapest material within your description, and if you have a very poor quality, it will just run out. So that is something that we have to enforce as part of the drawing set. We had to already make sure that we could specify the material very, very precisely. Now, there were, I believe, 14 materials that we could not find. We could either not supply or find different suppliers or describe with as much precision. One of them was the corrugated glass that we discussed earlier. And that is a very difficult process. And because this is quite a unique project, we actually, also the Taiwan local architects, asked us, like, please, can you help us to go through this, what we call the unique material procedure, to get particular approval for those 14 materials, saying that they're so unique that they should not be done or cannot be done by other parties, because they simply, or they had, how do you say, they had special laws kind of not allowing anybody to copy or to reproduce such materials. We went through that process. We got approval for those 14, I believe, different materials. And after that, it sort of backlashed, because there's now some politicians started using this law, and they said, oh, this law is really bad because it prices out our local suppliers and it favors international suppliers. So there's now what they call an anti-TPEC law, which is about materials, and is not in coordination with the kind of major government law, but it's a local law in the Taipei government that the method and the procedure that we have gone through is no longer allowed. So it's an extremely political process. And this is, again, one of those moments that I don't think the district councillor in charge of this was actually very interested in the material. I think he was interested in showing, him fighting for the people. And that is, of course, again, a public building like this. It's often more important what the public might think of it and what story you can make of it than what is the real story. And we have helped our clients sometimes to debunk those stories, and it takes a lot of time. It's very easy to make an accusation, but it's not so easy to debunk that, because you have to come with a lot of evidence that eventually most people are not so interested in, right? They're more interested in sort of gossip story than in technical details that show how it is or it's not correct. So yeah, it's been a hard process in that sense. Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions, or maybe from the audience? If not, maybe I can end with one last question. I think it was very exciting that you tried to introduce this public loop into this this program, like a program of the theatre, which is traditionally is quite private and quite reserved for the privileged. I was wondering, in the planning process of the circulation, was this the main idea? Was this public route like the main idea that was like key to the project, and then you plan everything around it? Or was the public, did it come later in the leftover spaces and then you tried to like connect the dots? Yeah, literally that. And I can tell you it was not so easy. We had an approved design there was a kind of double process that we went through the competition. We won the competition in 2 different phases. And then with that needed to become sort of code approved, because of course in the competition you try to comply with the major codes, but at some point you cannot work everything out in detail, of course. So there's another kind of layer of that makes a building really work, which is obviously always more difficult, because during the competition you might not
show the most contingent codes. You might, show enough staircases, but not too many, and you don't work out all the staircases into too much detail. So there was, on one hand, that kind of process that we had to fit in those code requirements in a kind of more precise way. And at the same time, we wanted to fit in that public loop, which was really not there yet, right? So we had basically one person studying this for several months, trying to find ways through the building that are on one hand very exciting, on the other hand possible. Then there was a budget constraint because we were running out of budget, and of course this is a sort of additional feature that that needs to be included in our budget. They wouldn't give us additional budgets because again it's a public project, so it's difficult for the government to keep adding additional money, which would potentially be a bit easier for a private client, of course. So then we just had to make it work. And initially we had, in our first design, we had maybe 7 or 8 different escalators, and we had to save cost on the escalators, literally. So we had to take out several escalators, and now you have to walk certain parts of the public loop, which make it a little bit less accessible for elderly, for example. Of course, wheelchair users cannot use an escalator, but the elderly are always important to, they cannot walk too many staircases. But it's, sometimes you have to take decisions, and there's still, for them, there's areas where they can shortcut. So it was worth kind of working around this project. And then the fact that you have, that spaces are generally over-dimensioned in theaters helps a little bit to, to make space for these kind of issues. Let me quickly share the screen to show you how we implemented this. So you see that this is basically the main back of house corridor with a width of 5 meters, which is very generous. It means that you can also have some space for storage of materials, of technologies and technical stuff. So we carved out. This is where you come from below, from the 3rd floor. You walk up. This is a staircase. You walk in here and you go further up. And that means that the space underneath this public loop, because this is a 5 meter high corridor, so the space between the public loop that goes on top and the space underneath can be used as a storage area that's about 2.5 meters high, which is enough for a storage space. So we really, we carved out spaces in order, and we kind of made a metal mesh in this area so that you can actually see the performers walking around in this area. And maybe you can see there's a little window here that looks onto the stage as you walk up. And if you walk another round, there's a window above here where you can look into the back or the side stage. So it's really constructed out of opportunities, and it was very exciting to have that kind of post operation as an additional project. And I really believe it was good that we did it, because it makes the project a bit more special. At the same time, of course, we don't know what's going to happen. And again, it's really up to the client to see how they will use this space. You may know that in the CCTV building in Beijing, we also have a public loop that is entirely closed to the audience. And Stephen Hall in Beijing also has the linked hybrid, which is supposed to be a public space with all these kind of public facilities. And it's closed off for the public and only accessible for the local residents. And that makes those spaces not viable to be used by the larger public. So it's always really important to consider really who's the client. Like, beautiful ideas are great, but then how can it really work out? And is the client open to kind of operating it in the way that you envision? If not, then it might be a bit of a waste of your space, of your time, and of your money.
Yeah, I really do hope that it works as.
Yeah, me too. It's
so
yeah, especially since the lady called it a tiny alley. That's for me, that was a sort of like, wow.
So before we end the session, can we have a group photo with everyone?
That would be great. That's a good idea.
So everyone, can you turn on your cameras, and I'll try to turn the laptop so that we can see everyone.
Nice.
Hi, Inge. I actually am in Hong Kong right now.
Hi, yeah, I heard.
Yeah, I just
Nice.
moved back.
Yeah, how are you doing? You moved
I'm
back?
good. Yeah.
Yeah?
Just like maybe a few weeks ago.
Ah,
I got out
okay.
of quarantine.
Wow, tough.
I know.
Yeah. Oh, we should go for a coffee.
Can.
If you're around Chinese U, maybe.
I live very near actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll reach out to you later.
Perfect. Yeah, very nice.
Awesome.
It's good to see you again.
Okay, get ready,
All the
everyone.
students, so cute.
Okay, one,
So
two.
Queen, can you take the screenshot?
Yeah, I'm taking a screenshot.
All right, thank you.
Okay, get ready, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one moment. I will go to the other page. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Will you share the screenshot with me?
Sure.
Great. Nice.
All right, so
Thank you.
thank you so much, Inge, for sharing with us and also spending your time and your students' time to be with us.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much. Again, super nice to be back in touch. And I hope that your students will reach out to you in 10 years from now and be as kind and as, as respectful. I really enjoy kind of seeing you guys again. And well, thank you also for the great listeners, great questions. I really enjoy that the questions were so spot on. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining today.
I was really happy to see this project again because we have seen it.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
See how
It comes back again.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, it's been a big part of my life. I had never expected, and if I would have never signed up for it, I think if I could have known that I would spend 12 years on this project, I would have stopped. And I think everybody, but it's almost there. Let's hope that it will really come together. Yeah.
We hope to see the real thing soon.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. And hope to travel again, because that has been very unfortunate. That I decided to stay on as a sort of consultant while I work here, but it's very unfortunate that we cannot actually see it, because seeing it in a picture or seeing it in person is a very different experience. But yeah, it is what it is, and hopefully things will open up soon again. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Keep in touch. Yeah. All the best to you. Good luck with the design of the theater. I hope to see. I'll check out the website later. Maybe you send me the links when the projects have been processed a little bit further.
No, sure.
To see what's going on. All right.
Okay.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Inge. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.